Power is not only a narrative, it's also a reality. It's a reality which creates great opportunities and gifts, but it also can be ugly. How does a Jewish nation use power justly? Can we fight a just war? How do we fight a just war justly? How do we deal with those people who for the first time we have power over? We knew what it was like to be a powerless nation. We know what it was like to demand of others responsibility and moral duties. What is it like when the coin is reversed? What is it like that when we have power? How do we think about it? But more importantly, how do we use it? As we take the Jewish narrative to the reality of Israel, we have to ask ourselves, what does this narrative obligate us towards? We could disagree as Jews, we could be left-wing, we could be right-wing, we could think that this war is just and that war is just, that we should have done this or done that. Those are the particulars of everyday life, which it's very healthy that we debate. However, what we must do in our covenant is step back and ask ourselves, what do we agree on? What are the principles of the use of power? Principles that will unite us all, and at the same time, principles that will obligate us all. Principles which will be used as the framework for reflecting on how Israel functions and what Israel ought to do. In celebrating and in being a lover of Israel and creating a place for Israel in our lives, it's not about accepting everything that Israel does, but it's about creating a framework for us to think about what Israel ought to do, so that that's the conversation. In thinking about where Israel ought to go and how we ought to use our power, and what is our shared value narrative in the concrete realities, which is the state of Israel, there are two separate issues that we have to reflect on. One is the issue of morality of war, and the second is occupation. As we think about these two challenges, it's important that we take a step back for a moment and recognize that in building a Jewish narrative on these questions, Judaism is deeply bifurcated. On the one hand, some of Jewish law on issues of power are worthy of profound emulation. And at the same time, there are significant texts within our tradition which do not reflect the morality of war that I believe we ought to aspire for as a people today. In the narrative which I would like to construct, which deals with the issues of morality of war and issues of occupation, I am going to selecting those sources that I believe ought to guide us as we move forward. When we rebuilt and returned to statehood, we returned in the 20th century. We returned with new senses of moral purpose and with new moral understandings as to the rights of individuals and our obligations to them. Our own right to self-determination, our right to sovereignty as a nation, is something that we understand and is reinforced precisely in the modern era. That right also recognizes the rights of others to self-determination, one of the key features which is absent in Jewish morality of war of antiquity. It's almost as if we could make a line and recognize that prior to the modern era, other nations' right to self-determination wasn't always recognized by the others. As we think about issues of morality of war and occupation, we have to sift within our tradition and create a moral vocabulary which reflects who we believe we ought to be and who we can be. There are going to be Jews who disagree. There are going to be Jews who are going to quote a different text. Our challenge, however, is to see whether we can delve within our texts and find a language which we believe represents what the rebirth of Israel in our own sovereign state can and ought to reflect. As we think about the issue of morality of war, in contemporary moral discourse, there is a clear distinction between just war and unjust war, between a war of self-defense and a war of aggression. And the principle of a just war is limited exclusively to a war of self-defense. A war in which a country is using its power and its military force to defend itself against an aggressor, against someone who's threatening their survival, their vitality, their independence, and the life of their citizens. This notion of just war as a war of self-defense finds a deep echo in our tradition, in the principle of the sanctity and obligation of self-defense. Haba lahorgecha hashkem lahorgo. If someone arises to threaten you and to kill you, you have to respond in self-defense and protect yourself and kill them first. It creates a principle in which the rights of every human being created in the image of God can only be abrogated when that individual is engaged in an active act of attacking you. You could kill only in self-defense. The Ten Commandments, which says, Lo tirtzach, thou shalt not murder, is not thou shalt not kill. Killing is sometimes necessary. What is forbidden is murder. When killing is done in self-defense, it is embracing of the value of human life because you recognize your value as a human being. Murder is the taking of life unnecessarily. And so the principle of self-defense as the foundation of just war is also grounded in the critical distinction in Jewish law between killing and murder. This, by the way, also is what defined one of the more beautiful and revolutionary texts in the rabbinic tradition. Actually reflecting the old morality in which I wasn't as sensitive to other people's rights to self-determination, God commands Moses and says to him, go out and fight a war, capture Heshbon. I gave it to you. It's good. I want you to capture that land. It'll motivate the nations of Israel to surrender and to fight with less fervor. Even though I don't want you to live in Heshbon, that's a war that I've given you license to fight. Moses, however, says no. Moses goes to Heshbon and says to them, I have no war with you. Let me pass by. Moses ignores God's commandment. God says go to war, and Moses says, I don't go to war if it's not a war of self-defense. If it's not a war to create my nation, if it's not to help the preservation of my people, it's a war that I don't embark upon. And instead of fighting, he turns to Heshbon and says, please, accept my hand in peace. Let me walk through. Anything that I touch, I'll pay for. Any food I eat, I'll pay for. Any water I drink, I'll pay for. Until I pass and return to and reach the homeland, which is my destiny. God has God's plan. And God overturns Heshbon's heart and forces the war. The rabbinic tradition, however, never accepts biblical morality as a given, and always feels free to redefine it when it believes it must do so. Here it incorporates the principles and the distinction between murder and killing into the issue of morality of war. And it declares that God ultimately agrees with Moses. And any war you embark upon, you must first offer peace. It is only when peace is not possible, and I would interpret it, it's only when war is the only consequence, when the only way to defend yourself is to fight, then you're allowed to go to war. If you don't need it for self-defense, if you don't need it for the survival and expression of your national sovereign rights, then the embarking on war is fundamentally illegitimate. This gets expressed, this principle, both of Jewish law and of international moral code, gets expressed in the IDF's spirit. The code which every Israeli soldier has to have in their pocket. Under this code, it starts with a recognition of the principle behind the words IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. And the notion is that the only war that someone is allowed to fight, that the war that the IDF is allowed to embark upon, is exclusively one of self-defense and self-preservation. The goal of the IDF is to protect the existence of the State of Israel and her independence, and to thwart all enemy efforts to disrupt the normal way of life in Israel. That's what it's about. That's our goal. We must be the Israel Defense Forces, and only as such is the use of our army legitimate. When the Israel Defense Forces is used for the other than the defense of the State of Israel and the protection of its citizens, it goes beyond its mandate. It ignores the principal distinction between murder and killing, and violates the core feature of morality of war, being a war exclusively of self-defense. How, however, do you fight a just war justly? This issue is getting more and more complicated as time goes on. The distinctions between armies and combatants, civilians, is becoming more difficult as the wars occur not in some esoteric battlefield, but they occur close to home, where the battlefield is very often in the midst of a civilian population. This issue, very often more than any other, creates profound discomfort with Israel, and very often generates a sense that any time that Israel uses power, it will use it unjustly. What happens when your enemy embeds themselves in their civilian population? Or what happens very often, as we state, that my enemy is willing to fight to the last blood of their civilian population? What happens when your enemy is not sensitive to their own losses, and in fact sees a moment in which you inflict civilian casualty as a victory? What do we do in these moments? What are our principles? How do we conduct ourselves? What is morality in war? Morality in war has three fundamental principles. The first is the core distinction between combatant and non-combatant. You cannot target intentionally non-combatants. While in war sometimes non-combatants will be harmed, the intentional targeting of non-combatants is a war crime and violates the principles of morality in war. The second general recognized principle is that of proportionality. You could only use the amount of force necessary in order to achieve your goal to defend yourself. And the third is that even if your enemy challenges you on these first two, embeds itself in a civilian population, makes your implementation of these principles extremely difficult, the fact that your enemy makes it difficult does not free you from trying to and having the obligation to attempt to approximate your principles to the best of your ability. The moral failure of your enemy doesn't remove moral aspirations from the battlefield. These points find expression as well within Jewish law. One of the critical distinctions in morality of war, in proportionality, in which I'm only supposed to use that amount of force necessary in order to prevent the evil, finds expression in the Talmudic discussion regarding Yoav and Avner. Yoav is justified in killing Avner only to the extent that Avner was a murderer, and Avner was a murderer because he didn't have to kill Amasa, he could have just injured him. The principle of proportionality is what enables you to maintain the distinction between murder and killing. Even if you are in a war of self-defense, and you could use a more limited response in order to achieve your aim, the using of the more radical response is one that undermines the legitimacy of your actions. War is not a freezing of the conversation. In the midst of war, you have to make very, very difficult decisions. Now, these difficult decisions aren't decisions made in a laboratory. They're decisions made in the heat of battle, in impossible situations. And the moral principles are one which a commander would think about in the heat of battle. The principle of proportionality, however, in maintaining the distinction between murdering and killing, is a key feature which we have to remember as we think about issues of the legitimacy of fighting and how we fight. The notion that if somebody says to you, I want to kill you unless you kill somebody else, and your duty to die rather than kill someone else creates the notion of the innocent bystander and your obligation to protect them. The fact that someone's existence endangers you does not give you license to kill them. Rather, if you do so just merely because they're endangering you, it will be murder. The only thing that moves it from murder to killing is if they personally are actively engaged in harming you, in threatening you. Their mere existence and the fact that your survival needs their removal in order to exist does not allow you to translate the action into one that is morally legitimate under self-defense. The principle of Kiddush Hashem and of not killing somebody else, and the principle of proportionality within Jewish law echo deeply in the international conversation and set the standards of what an Israeli soldier must attempt to live by. And it's interesting here too, again, these principles find expression in the IDF spirit, in the purity of arms. The IDF servicemen and women will use their weapons and force only to the purpose of their mission, self-defense, only to the necessary extent, proportionality, and will maintain their humanity even during combat, very often the critical issue in order to maintain proportionality. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons or force to harm human beings who are not combatants, the principle of innocent bystanders, or prisoners, or can we harm prisoners of war? And will do all in their power, including endangering ourselves, to avoid causing harm to the lives, bodies, dignity, and property of these civilians. These principles are exceptionally difficult principles to implement in war. No one's undermining that complexity. No one's denying it. Israel is not perfect, and at issue today is not the judging of what Israel did or did not do. What we have to come together on is to determine, do we accept these principles for a Jewish army? Do we create a new Torah which combines international law, contemporary morality of war, with some of the ancient principles of our tradition, which demand of us to recognize the sanctity of human life and to refrain from murder, and to only take a life to the extent that I was under danger, to the extent that it was necessary, to the extent that I had no other choice. In many ways, one of the more beautiful texts on this is the text in Sanhedrin which says, you can kill someone who's coming to attack you on one condition. You have to be certain. Now in the Talmud they debate, what is certainty? Do I have to be certain that they don't want peace? Do I have to be certain that they're coming to harm me? But this principle of certainty, this obligation to be certain, is what elevates an action from murder to a legitimate action of self-defense and enables a Jewish army to be an army which could identify itself exclusively in terms of defense, and which sees the maintaining of its moral standards as a key aspect of its success, of its vitality, and of its strength. Beyond the issue, however, of war, which with all its complexity is very often forced upon us, there is an ongoing struggle within Israeli society and within Jews around the world who are looking to have a relationship with Israel on how we think about the issue of occupation. More than any other issue, the issue of occupation is forcing Jews to ask whether they have to choose between their Jewish values and their love for Israel. How do we think about occupation? How does a Jew, and how do we combine moral principles and international law to think about what ought to be the Israel policy on occupation, regardless of whether you are left-wing and right-wing, regardless of what you think Israel's security needs demand? What are the core value narrative that we ought to adopt on this issue of occupation? Here, it's important that we start not with international law, but that we start with who we are and what is our story. One of the key features of Jewish law is that not only are we obligated to love ourselves, and not only are we obligated to love our fellow citizens, we are also obligated to love the stranger. But it's not simply the love of stranger. Our tradition teaches us that you must love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The core moral lesson of our tradition is that you have to use your history, your past, your experiences, and never forget them. That when you have to implement your policy, you implement it as a result of your memory of where you were and what you experienced. It's in many ways the deepest expression of what Hillel demands: what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. We know what it's like when sovereignty is denied us. We know what it's like when people say to us, you're not a nation, you're a religion. The principles of occupation are as follows. A, occupation is only legitimate when it is a result and the consequence of a just war. We cannot occupy another people and look ourselves in the mirror unless we recognize that we had no choice. The war of self-defense of '67, which instituted the occupation, thus constitutes a legitimate framework for us to recognize this is not something that we chose. But if occupation is only legitimate if it is a result of a just war, then it's critical that we do everything in our power to bring that occupation to an end. 2, no actions will be done to sustain an occupation and to cause its perpetuation unless those actions are necessary for self-defense. You have to do everything in your power to bring an occupation to an end, and you must refrain from doing anything in an occupied area and to an occupied people which is not absolutely necessary for your own survival and your own security. And finally, within that occupation, you are extremely careful to preserve and maintain the rights of a human being to dignity, to life, to property. We are occupiers not because we wanted to be occupiers. We are occupiers because a situation was forced upon us as a result of a war of self-defense. The test that we have today, the test to our narrative of power, the test to what extent we're going to use our power justly, will not always be expressed on whether we walk out and bring the occupation to an end. Because whether we can bring an occupation to an end or not is not just dependent on us. Here, however, that's politics and that's not our agenda. I don't care if you're right-wing or left-wing. To be a Jew who remembers that you were a stranger in Egypt, who knows that to be a moral human being is to treat others as you would want to be treated. And what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That's the whole Torah. Requires of all of us that on the issue of occupation we combine together to accept occupation as an evil which was forced upon us, and that we must do everything in our power to bring it to an end, and completely refrain from anything that will cause its perpetuation, which has nothing to do with our security needs. And as occupiers, we are extremely sensitive to the rights of that people who we recognize that until they come home, until they have their place, we don't have our place. To recognize the obligations of morality of in war and morality of war. And to recognize our need to have a vision vis-a-vis occupation, which recognizes that while not everything that we have, that what is not necessarily where we want to be. To combine those two together serves as a new foundation, a foundation of a Jewish narrative of power, which obligates us to do it and to use it justly. Can we use power justly? The answer is very simple. We are obligated to. Power is a gift, but it is also a responsibility. It creates deep and significant moral challenges. One of the basic questions that Israelis and Jews have around the world when they think about Israel is, how do we think about, how do we respond to, and how do we define the moral responsibilities that Israel and we Jews have towards the territory and the people who we have captured/occupied since 1967. And I use the word slash because there's a debate. Jews don't necessarily see this as occupied territory. Is it occupied territory? Is the West Bank occupied?
Well, I think it depends whether we're trying to win an argument here or imagine what the right thing for us to do as a country is. I can make a case, a legal case, that it isn't occupied. And some people think that that's where the conversation should end. But first of all, for 3.8 million Palestinians and for most of the world, it is occupied. And the question we need to ask ourselves is not just how do we win that argument, even if you take the view that it isn't occupied. The question is, what do we do with a people on our border that want their self-determination rights? Do we throw arguments at them and hope that they'll go away or be convinced?
Like what argument would we throw? It's our homeland?
Well, we might make that argument, but they won't buy it. If we think we're going to convince them, we're mistaken. So the question is then, what is the dynamic? What as not as a favour to them, by the way, but as the Jewish people in a state of their own, what is our obligation to a people that do not want to live under our rule? To convince them that we're right? I'm not sure that we do ourselves the best service by that view. In fact, I think our better approach is to ask ourselves, what is it that we are Jewishly obligated to do when we rule areas which do not want to be subject to our rule?
So it doesn't matter almost what it's called.
It matters if you want, in some audiences in the debate of public opinion. And you can make arguments, and I won't bore you with them, about the Geneva Conventions and whether they apply and whether they don't apply in what circumstances. But for me, it's beside the point. What's special about this project that we're engaged is we're not asking, how do we deal with the criticism? How do we push back? We're asking what is right to do from a Jewish perspective. And the question we need to ask is not, is it occupied or isn't occupied, but what do you do in a situation where land which you have a claim to, land which you feel connected to historically and religiously, is also land on which another people resides and want to be able to express their rights to self-determination.
So under those issues, there is this other people and another land, a people which sees themselves as a people wanting to live in their own land.
Yes.
Let's call it occupation. From their perspective, we're occupying them. Yes. From an international legal perspective, we're occupying them. Is there ever conditions under which such an occupation or such a reality will be justified?
Well, first, I think, it's often misunderstood, but occupation is a state of affairs. It's a thing that happens. It happens sometimes as a result of war, that you come to be in control of territories that before the war you weren't in control of. That more or less is the definition of occupation in a very simplistic kind of way. Now, whether it's legitimate to continue to maintain that occupation or not turns first and foremost on whether what brought you there was a legitimate act of war, a legitimate act of self-defense, or an aggressive design, a desire for territorial aggrandizement, for increasing the territory you control.
But under the notion that everybody always sees themselves as fighting wars of self-defense, I always have a narrative as to why my war was legitimate. So our 67 narrative, and I think it's a well-founded one, is a narrative of self-defense. But let's say all occupations, all occupiers have a self-defense narrative.
Yes.
So let's say is there any place where that occupation becomes fundamentally immoral?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between two things. First of all, how you conduct yourself as an occupier, and the balance that you need to strike between your right to protect your own forces and your own civilians to your duty to ensure the welfare of the population that you control against their will. And that an occupation can become immoral if it crosses the line and doesn't maintain that. That's the first aspect of it in the way you conduct. And then the question is...
Give me an example.
Well...
Roadblocks.
Roadblocks, for instance. So the balance between having roadblocks so that we don't have terrorists blowing themselves up in Israeli cities, but ensuring that those roadblocks are as humane as possible, respectful, efficient. That is an obligation we have. And also minimizing them to the absolute extent necessary to create that right balance. In each situation, that balance is different. It's a calibration that you need to make. That's one part of it. The other part relates to whether the maintaining of the occupation, the state of the occupation, can become immoral at any point of time. And I think that turns on whether you have a reasonable opportunity to end it without endangering what are your core national security requirements. if that opportunity exists, and you have an obligation to try to create those opportunities.
What does that mean? Because we could always say, I'm trying.
Well, what it means will be different for different people. It says, again, this isn't about what we can say. This is about whether we genuinely feel that we're making as great an effort as possible to bring an end to a situation that, in the end, is something that the Jewish people shouldn't want.
This creates a very precarious situation internally within the Jewish community. Because we're talking here about the term moral. Right?
Yes.
And therefore, if somebody doesn't follow certain terms, that means you're immoral, which is a significant criticism. For some, the reality of the Palestinians is one in which they have rejected peace. That's the narrative we tell. They've rejected peace. Any peace overture, any peace move is dangerous for us. And you yourself said, I have to balance. So when they look at the balance, they say, I can't get out of here. And as a result, it would be immoral. I'd be endangering the state of Israel if I tried to get out of here. On the other hand, there's others who say, excuse me, we haven't done enough. And therefore we need to do more, and we're being immoral. And so each part of the Jewish community is seeing each other as immoral.
Well, first of all, I think you can fail to make peace, and you can make a failed peace. You can do both things. You can be too blinded in being able to see opportunities to make partners of those who do want or can come to terms with coexistence. But you can also fail on the other side in terms of making too dangerous concessions and risks things. I think what we need first is to create the basic principles about which to have this conversation. Can we agree that as a people, the notion of ruling a people that do not want to be ruled is not a good idea? Can we agree that we need to try to find the ways in which to end that situation safely, responsibly? Then we can have an argument about what it is to be responsible, what it is to be safe, without perhaps labeling one as moral or the other as immoral. Because the issues are very complex, and you know what else? It's not in our hands alone. We need a bit of humility. We don't get to dictate the outcome here. We do what we can, but we are hostage to a situation to a certain extent. And we have an obligation, in my opinion, to respect and recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination, but not if its expression means the destruction of our right to self-determination.
Let's take the concrete example of settlements.
Yes.
One of the most difficult and contentious issues. There's both settlements and settlement expansions, and which settlements, etc. There's the settlement blocks and other settlements. For many Jews, settlements are an expression that this is not occupied land.
Yes.
For others, it is occupied land, and therefore settlement itself violates one of the principles that you mentioned. And that is the principle that you have to do everything in your power to bring it to an end. So now we're talking about settlement expansion. What should be, and I'm not talking vis-a-vis world opinion, I'm talking as Jews, what should be our attitude towards settlement expansion, precisely using the categories that you define?
Well, first, I think there can be different answers to this question. So I really come at this from a personal perspective. I think that the message we send by expanding settlements, the message that received is that we're not serious about a two-state solution. And within the context that...
To be serious about a two-state solution is a moral requirement?
I think so, because what it means to be serious about a two-state solution is that you recognize that there are other rights in this space, not just your own.
And every Israeli government since the 90s has basically accepted the principle of a two-state solution.
Well, they've accepted it. I think you could ask whether they've accepted it as a slogan or as a principle in which to act according to.
As a policy. Mm-hmm.
And it's not always because they haven't wanted to move forward. There are real constraints, both political internal constraints and external constraints, that makes it actually very hard to make decisions that advance a policy even which you're completely committed to. There is a degree of paralysis in our decision-making which we need to overcome. And frankly, the Palestinian side sometimes, because of their constraints or sometimes because of their misjudgment, makes it more difficult for Israel to make the decisions that they want us to make. And that would be helpful for us to make. This isn't a zero-sum game in that perspective. Now, we have a legitimate claim to lots of the areas here. This is the cradle of Jewish civilization. And we need to make some very, very difficult decisions about whether this is about the past or the future to a certain extent. How do we calibrate correctly between our expression of our connection to the land and our need to create a vibrant Jewish and democratic existence here that isn't threatened and delegitimized? In the area of governance, you don't get to be utopian too often. You get to do that in speeches. But in the choices you make, you very often have to choose between bad options. And the option of building in a way that, in a sense, is seen as and undermines the dynamic towards a two-state solution, in the end hurts us. Because it takes us further away from being able to build that vibrant Jewish state that is legitimate and protected and defended.
Would it be fair to say that, regardless of what you call it, occupation, control over another people who don't want to be controlled, make distinctions between people and land, that our primary responsibility is to be a people leading in the conversation of peace? Doesn't mean that we have to implement it. There are grave dangers, and it's not simple, and it takes two sides to make peace. And we know that this story is a very, very difficult story here. The blame game we've played long enough. But that the core responsibility of Israel, as somebody who today is controlling / occupying another people in another land, is to always lead in initiatives. Always keep on trying. I feel that the job of Israel is to always put yourself out there, for being, even if it's to be rejected, but that if we don't lead, then occupation becomes immoral. Then it becomes occupation.
I think, this is not a favor we're doing to President Obama, and it's not a favor we're doing to the Palestinians by saying to ourselves, we want to be a society that pushes towards coexistence, both within and with our neighbours, even in almost impossible situations. It doesn't mean the decision, as you say, we'll make may be too difficult to make at that moment, may be too dangerous, but we're always looking for avenues. Again, and it's also not, in my mind, about how we're perceived. The first question, imagine everyone applauded no matter what Israel did. Imagine the world applauded. This is about us. What kind of state do we want to have? And it's a state that fights not only for its own rights, but for the responsible expression of the rights of others. That's the kind of state I think we should be aiming for. Now, we can differ about how we apply it, but we shouldn't differ about the goal that that's what we're about.
Differ about how we apply it, meaning you can be left-wing, you can be right-wing, where you want to put the border,
Absolutely.
Which settlement blocks, how much is given up, 75%, 85, 95.
And also about what risk. We sometimes talk about peace as if the option, we're in a great situation now, and unless you can offer this utopian peace as an alternative, then forget about it. No, because the status quo also isn't great. The status quo, in fact, isn't a status quo, it's degenerating. And that choice between the absence of a suboptimal agreement versus an agreement which isn't everything we dreamed of, but it might be better, is a choice that different people will make differently. But let's not pretend that what's on offer is the utopia we have now, and unless you offer another utopia, then there's nothing to talk about.
But in this utopia, so-called, at least aren't we more relatively safe?
Well, I think you could have a real legitimate argument about that. The questions that are being asked today about the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state have a lot to do with the fact that there isn't a place for the Palestinians to realize their rights to self-determination. We can like it or not like it, but until we at least are seen to be and are involved in this effort to realize the rights of others, not just our own, even though it's not completely in our hands, people will be asking questions about us as well.
And undermining our security as a result.
I think so. Because, and this is also to do with something internal, because in order to fight, you need to know why you are fighting. And unless it's a value-driven conversation, you feel good about the country you live in, you feel good about its values, you know that it has tried and will continue to try every alternative to the option of picking up arms, then it's much harder to pick up arms when you have to, and to rally people to that call. So it makes sense internally.
To use Tal's language, we have a choice on how we balance the past and the future. In the Middle East, it always seems to be about the past. This cradle of civilization has been the place where so much has happened. The question is, to what extent we're going to find a way to balance the meaning that we get from being connected to that past and the meaning that we want to get by providing a new future and a new direction. We can't have a future without a past, but a people who only live in the past, literally, don't have a future. Thank you very much.